In broad daylight, in the middle of a small American town, a man was killed in front of dozens of witnesses. There were no masks, no darkness, no confusion about what happened. And yet, more than 40 years later, no one has ever been charged. Not because the evidence disappeared, not because the investigation failed, but because an entire town chose silence. This is not just a murder story. It's a case study in fear, power, community justice, and the uncomfortable question of what happens when the law no longer feels like protection. This is the story of Skidmore, Missouri, and the killing the town never spoke about. Skidmore is the kind of town most people never think about. A few hundred residents, quiet streets, everyone knows everyone. In places like this, reputations last longer than facts, and history is passed down through memory rather than records. For decades, one name dominated Skidmore more than any other: Rex McElroy. To outsiders, McElroy was a local farmer. To the town, he was something else entirely. By the late 1970s, McElroy had been accused repeatedly of crimes ranging from theft to intimidation. Witnesses would later say he carried weapons openly, threatened neighbors, and made it clear that retaliation was always an option. But accusations never turned into consequences. Why? Because every time McElroy was charged, witnesses suddenly refused to testify. Statements were withdrawn. Evidence became unusable. People stayed silent, not because they didn't know, but because they were afraid. This pattern continued for years. McElroy became untouchable, not by law, but by fear. In 1981, the tension finally reached its breaking point. A local shop owner accused McElroy of stealing from his store. This time, the accusation stuck. McElroy was convicted, but even then, he wasn't immediately imprisoned. He remained free while appealing the verdict. To the people of Skidmore, this felt like the system failing once again. According to multiple accounts, residents believed the law could not or would not protect them. Complaints had gone nowhere. Appeals dragged on, and McElroy returned to town as if nothing had changed. On July 10th, 1981, the town gathered near the local bar. It wasn't a planned meeting, just people in the same place at the same time, carrying years of frustration. McElroy arrived with his wife and sat in his truck. Minutes later, gunfire erupted. When it stopped, McElroy was dead. Dozens of people were present. Law enforcement arrived quickly. Witnesses were questioned immediately, and something unprecedented happened. No one saw anything. No one could identify a shooter. No one described a suspect. No one provided usable testimony. Not one. To investigators, the case was baffling. Statistically, a murder with that many witnesses should be solvable within days. But this wasn't a typical crime scene. It was a community decision, whether spoken aloud or not. The silence wasn't accidental. It was collective. Residents later told journalists that they felt relief, not grief. Some said they believed justice had finally arrived, not through the courts, but through the community itself. From a legal standpoint, this posed a nightmare. The justice system depends on cooperation. Without witnesses, cases collapse. And in Skidmore, silence became the strongest force of all. The investigation stalled. Years passed, then decades. No arrests, no indictments, no official resolution. Criminologists and legal scholars still study this case today, not because of the murder itself, but because of what it reveals about systemic failure. When communities stop trusting institutions, they don't stop seeking justice. They redefine it. In Skidmore, the law existed, but legitimacy did not. Residents believed the system protected the accused more than the victims. That belief, right or wrong, reshaped their moral framework. Silence became loyalty. Cooperation became betrayal. This isn't unique to Skidmore. Across American history, similar patterns appear wherever fear outweighs trust. When people believe reporting crime leads to retaliation instead of protection, justice goes underground. And once that happens, accountability disappears for everyone. The murder of Rex McElroy remains officially unsolved. Law enforcement agencies have acknowledged that they know more than they can prove. Suspects were rumored. Names circulated quietly. But without testimony, The law had no path forward. The town never confessed. The town never explained. The town moved on. But the question remains, was this justice? Or was it the moment the rule of law quietly collapsed? Today, Skidmore still exists. New residents live alongside old memories. But the story hasn't faded. It's taught in law schools, referenced in ethics debates, cited in discussions about vigilantism and community silence. Because the most unsettling part of this case isn't that a man was killed. It's that an entire town agreed, without speaking, to let it happen, and then never spoke again. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The justice system is only as strong as the trust people place in it. When that trust breaks, the consequences don't always look like chaos. Sometimes they look like order, quiet, unified, permanent. And 40 years later, the murder that everyone witnessed remains officially unseen. This story made you question how justice truly works. Not in theory, but in practice. Then you understand why cases like this still matter. Because the most dangerous crimes aren't always the ones no one saw. But the story of Skidmore doesn't end with the shooting itself. To truly understand what happened, we need to go deeper into the town, the people, and the system that allowed one man to intimidate an entire community for decades. Even after McElroy's death, historians and sociologists would describe Skidmore as a case study in collective fear. Small towns like this are not just communities. They are networks of intertwined relationships. When one person wields power and intimidation for years, everyone adapts their behavior to survive. People who might have spoken out were forced into silence by the simple understanding that retaliation was always possible. And this fear wasn't imaginary, it had a history. McElroy's confrontations with neighbors, verbal threats, and documented harassment created a culture of silence. Experts say this is called a community defense mechanism. It is a natural response when trust in the law has eroded. And it was not unique to Skidmore. Across the United States, similar dynamics have occurred where small towns handled crimes internally, outside formal justice channels. Law enforcement's role in Skidmore was complicated. The local sheriff's department was aware of McElroy's crimes. State and federal authorities occasionally intervened. Yet every time they tried to prosecute, witnesses refused to testify. Prosecutors had no choice but to drop charges or settle for minimal convictions. From an investigative standpoint, Skidmore exposed a major weakness in the legal system. Cases collapse when community cooperation is absent, no matter how strong the evidence is. This isn't just theory. Legal scholars cite Skidmore in textbooks on criminal justice and ethical policing. We can learn from this. Modern law enforcement emphasizes witness protection, community engagement, and anonymity for informants. In Skidmore, these protections didn't exist. Residents felt alone, leaving the law ineffective. The killing raises difficult moral questions. Was this vigilantism justified? Could the townspeople have acted differently? Ethicists argue that while the legal system aims to protect individuals and communities, there are instances where mistrust and fear override legal processes. In Skidmore, decades of inaction forced residents to redefine justice on their own terms. Psychologists call this phenomenon collective moral judgment under duress. Essentially, the town decided that if the system couldn't stop a threat, the people would, but with consequences that were both unpredictable and permanent. These lessons are especially relevant today, in cities or towns where law enforcement struggles to balance authority, fairness, and protection. Decades later, Skidmore is a quiet town again. New families moved in. Streets have changed. Businesses opened and closed. But the story of McElroy's death remains part of the town's identity. A cautionary tale, often told quietly in classrooms, legal discussions, and sociological research. Some residents feel guilt. Some feel relief. Some still refuse to speak about it. And this, perhaps more than the murder itself, is the most important lesson. The consequences of silence and fear echo long after the moment of crime has passed. The American justice system relies on cooperation, trust, and transparency. But Skidmore reminds us that when those pillars weaken, communities make their own decisions. often in ways the law cannot recognize or rectify. This case forces us to ask a question still relevant today. What happens when justice fails not because it is absent, but because people believe it is? Skidmore shows that the answer is complicated. The town acted collectively, silently, and decisively. But justice, in its legal sense, remained elusive. The murder of Ken Rex McElroy is officially unsolved. Yet, the story continues to educate, caution, and challenge the assumptions of law, morality, and human behavior. In the end, this is not just a story about one murder in one town. It is a story about fear, morality, and a fragile balance between law and human action. And it is a story the world must not forget, the ones everyone chose not to see.